In the summer of 2019, every cattle rancher in Custer County, Montana vaccinated their herds. This was not a choice, it was the calendar. The spring pink eye season came to Custer County the way the Yellowstone River came down from the mountains, not because anyone invited it, but because that was the nature of the place and the time of year. And nobody who had ranched there for more than one season needed to be told what happened when you missed the window. The county had been ranching cattle through the dust years of the 30s, through the hard winters of the 50s and 60s, when the drifts came over the fence lines and you lost animals you couldn't afford to lose, through the BSE scare of the early 2000s, when the beef market went sideways and half the operations in the region were underwater before the summer was out. The ranches were built for cattle. The veterinary infrastructure was built for cattle. The lending relationships at the bank in Miles City were written against cattle. And in the summer of 2019, with beef prices at $1.24 per pound on the rail and the Extension Office projecting a clean season if producers stayed ahead of the vaccination schedule, there was not a single person in Custer County who thought skipping the window made any sense at all. Let me tell you about what happened in July of that year, because it is the reason this story exists. And it is the reason that one ranch in Custer County looks different from every other ranch in the county today. The pink eye vaccination window in Montana is not forgiving. You get a narrow stretch in late June and early July when the fly pressure is building but before the full infection load arrives. When you can still work the cattle without stressing them into a condition that makes the vaccine less effective. Miss that window and you are chasing the infection instead of preventing it. The ranchers in Custer County understood this the way they understood the weather. Not as information they had been given, but as something they had learned through the specific education of watching animals suffer when they had gotten it wrong. So when the window opened in the last week of June 2019, every rancher in the county who ran more than 200 head was using the same system to manage it. It was a livestock health platform called CattleTrack Pro, a cloud-based software that had come into the county in force starting around 2016, sold hard by the regional agricultural technology distributor out of Billings. The system tracked individual animal health records through RFID ear tags, flagged animals due for vaccination, generated the working orders for each day's shoot work, and kept the compliance records that the county's larger feedlot buyers had started requiring as a condition of purchase contracts in 2018. The system was genuinely useful, nobody disputed that. It had reduced the time a ranch manager spent on paperwork by an estimated 4 hours per week. It had caught early health events that a busy operation might have missed. The ranchers who had adopted it had not regretted it, most of them. But by 2019, the system had become more than a tool. It had become the infrastructure. The working orders came out of the software. The shoot crew worked the list the software generated. The records went back into the software at the end of each day. Nobody in the county had a paper backup system that was current, because the software had made paper systems redundant, and redundant systems don't get maintained. On the morning of July 8, 2019, CattleTrack Pro went down. The company pushed a mandatory server migration over a holiday weekend that ran long. The system came back up in a degraded state that corrupted the synchronization between the RFID reader app on the ranch tablets and the central database. Animals that had been vaccinated were showing as unvaccinated. Animals due for boosters were not appearing on the working orders at all. The error messages were specific enough to tell you something was wrong and vague enough to tell you nothing about how to fix it. The technical support line had a 4-hour wait by 9 in the morning. The 3 ranches in the county tried to work cattle anyway, pulling up what records they could from the corrupted interface and making their best guesses. One operation near Forsyth gave boosters to 17 animals that had already received them within the past 10 days, which is not dangerous but is wasteful and throws off the compliance records that the feedlot buyer requires. Another operation south of Miles City sent its crew home by noon because the foreman could not confidently identify which animals were due and which were not, and he was not willing to guess with a $28 per dose vaccine on a herd of 460 head. By early afternoon, most of the county's mid-sized operations had stopped working cattle. The platform company's status page said the issue was being addressed. It said the same thing at 3 p.m. It said the same thing at 6 p.m. The ranchers who had been sitting in their trucks watching their crews stand idle were now calculating how many days they had left in the effective window and what it would cost them if they fell behind. In a county where pink eye losses in an unvaccinated herd could run to 3 to 5% of animals in a bad fly year, and where a bad fly year was exactly what the entomologists at the Extension office had been predicting since April, that was not a number anyone wanted to sit with. Let me tell you about Harriet Cobb because you need to understand the woman before you can understand what she did that morning. Harriet was 57 years old in the summer of 2019 and had ranched the same wilting 800 acres her parents had bought in 1974 on the east side of Custer County, 12 miles outside the town of Ismay. Her father, Raymond Cobb, had come to that ground from a smaller operation in Wyoming, had run it through the cattle market collapse of the 1980s without losing the land, and had handed it to Harriet in 2001 when his knees finally told him he was done working the chutes himself. Her mother, Jean, had kept the books for 31 years by hand in a series of green ledger notebooks that still sat in a row on the shelf above the desk in the ranch office. Harriet had never replaced the ledger system with software. Not because she was opposed to software, she used it for other things. For the cattle records that the feedlot buyers wanted, she had used a different system before CattleTrack arrived and had never found the new platform compelling enough to switch. She ran her vaccination schedule from a paper card file she had inherited from her father and updated herself every season, a physical index card for each animal with its ear tag number handwritten at the top, its vaccination history in blue pen below, and a small red dot in the corner when the animal was current. The card file lived in a metal box on the passenger seat of her truck during working season. She had been keeping it that way since 2003. She had looked at CattleTrack Pro when it came into the county. She had attended the demonstration at the fairgrounds in Miles City in 2017 and had asked questions that the demonstrator had not expected, questions about what happened to the working orders if the synchronization failed, about where the local backup was stored, about what the recovery procedure looked like if the system was unavailable during a critical window. The demonstrator had given her answers that were technically accurate and practically unsatisfying, and she had driven home from Miles City and set the brochure on the seat next to the card file box and not thought much more about it. She was not against the technology. She was against the idea of a system that required something she could not control in order to do something she had been doing reliably for 16 years without it. On the morning of July 8th, Harriet Cobb pulled her truck out of the yard at 5:45 in the morning, the card file box on the passenger seat, the cooler with the vaccine in the truck bed. She had 340 head to work through the chutes that week. She had already pulled the cards for the animals due that day, 63 head, and rubber banded them together and set them on top of the box. Her crew was a nephew named Boyd, who had been helping with chute work for 6 summers. and a high school girl named Adrian who had started the previous year and was fast with the ear tag reader and didn't flinch when the cattle moved against her. Harriet did not know the platform was down. She would find out when she stopped at the feed store in Ismay at noon for a bag of mineral supplement, and the man behind the counter mentioned that his neighbor over on the Forsyth Road had been on hold with cattle tracks since morning. By that time, Harriet had worked 41 animals. Let me tell you about what was happening at the Custer County Stockmen's Association meeting room in Miles City that same morning, because that is where the other part of this story lives. The association had a room above the co-op bank on Main Street that it used for meetings and, on days like this one, for the informal gathering that happens when enough ranchers have a problem at the same time and need somewhere to be while they figure out what to do about it. By 10 in the morning, there were 9 ranchers in that room, most of them on their phones with either their crews or the cattle track support line. And the mood was the specific mood of people who have planned carefully and been failed by something that was supposed to make planning easier. The person talking the most was a man named Drew Schofield. Drew was the regional sales consultant for Agritech Central, the Billings distributor that had sold Cattle Track Pro to most of the ranches in the county. He was 38 years old, drove a lease truck that was too clean for the roads in this part of Montana, and had sold approximately $1.4 million in livestock management software to Custer County operations since 2016. He was good at his job. He genuinely believed in the product. And he was in the room because 3 of his clients had called him before 8 a.m., and he had driven up from Billings because he understood that this kind of situation required presence, not voicemail. The migration was supposed to be transparent, he was saying, standing near the whiteboard at the front of the room. The synchronization issue is a known bug from the new server environment. They're working on a patch right now. The data is intact. Nothing has been lost. The working orders will come back up as soon as the sync is restored. He said it with the steady confidence of a man who has been on the phone with the platform company's account team for 2 hours and has been given assurances he is now passing along to people who are watching money leave their operations in real time. One of the ranchers, a younger man named Pete Halverson, who had come into his father's operation 4 years earlier and had adopted cattle track within the first month, asked what they were supposed to do in the meantime. Drew said they could try to reconstruct working orders from the last clean export if they had one. Most of them didn't, because the system had made manual exports feel unnecessary. He said the patch was estimated at 2 to 4 hours. He had been saying that since 9 a.m. It was a rancher named Carl Tremblay who mentioned Harriet Cobb. Carl had driven past the Cobb place on his way into Miles City and had seen the chute crew working, the cattle moving through at the pace of a ranch that knew exactly what it was doing. He had not stopped, but he had noticed, and he mentioned it the way you mention something that seems both obvious and slightly embarrassing once you have said it out loud. Harriet Cobb's been running cattle since first light, he said. She doesn't use the platform, still does it on index cards. Paper records, the whole thing. She was already halfway through her first pen when I went past. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Drew Schofield smiled. It was not a dismissive smile, exactly, but it was the smile of a man who has spent 3 years explaining the inadequacy of paper systems and who finds the current conversation to be moving in an inconvenient direction. Paper cards, he said. Okay, sure, you know what the error rate is on a manually maintained card file across a herd of 300 head over a 5-year vaccination history. It's not 0. You know what the error rate is on a system with RFID verification and digital records. It's as close to 0 as the technology allows. He looked around the room. A few of the ranchers nodded, a few did not. Let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever been in a room where someone dismissed an option not because the option didn't work, but because admitting it worked would have required them to say something they were not ready to say? Drew Schofield was not wrong about the error rates. Digitally verified records are more accurate than handwritten index cards on average across large populations. But accuracy on average is not the same thing as availability when you need it. And what the room needed that morning was not the option with the lowest long-run error rate. It was the option that was working. Carl Tremblay drove back past the Cobb place on his way home that afternoon. Harriet was finishing her last pen of the day, Boyd running the squeeze chute, Adrian marking the cards as each animal came through, Harriet pulling the next card from the rubber band stack before the previous animal was even out of the chute. The operation had the rhythm of something that had been done the same way for a long time by people who had learned how to do it from people who had been doing it before them. Carl rolled down his window when Harriet walked to the truck for her water bottle. He told her about the platform outage, about the meeting in Miles City, about the morning that the rest of the county had spent waiting. Harriet listened. She drank her water. Then she said, "The cattle don't know what software we're using." She put the water bottle back in the truck and walked back to the chute. Let me tell you about the next 4 days because they matter. Cattle Track Pro came back up fully on the evening of July 9th, approximately 34 hours after the initial failure. The county's operations went back to their working orders and caught up through the remainder of the week. The window was compressed but not missed. The ranchers who had lost a day and a half were not ruined, but they were behind, and a vaccination window in a bad fly year has costs that don't always show up until September. Harriet Cobb finished her 340 head on July 11th on schedule, 1 day ahead of the date she had set in March when she built out her summer working calendar. Every card in the file was updated. Every record was current. She knew the status of every animal on the place the same way she had known it in 2005 and 2010, and every year between, because she had written it down herself in sequence, in the system that her father had built and she had maintained. The county did not make a public event of this. Custer County ranchers do not generally make public events of things. But the people who drove past the Cobb place during the window and who knew what they were looking at noticed that the operation was running and the cattle were worked and the season was proceeding the way a well-run season proceeds, without drama and without waiting on hold with a technical support line. Drew Schofield drove past the Cobb place on his way back to Billings on July 12th. He slowed down at the gate. He did not pull in, but he looked at the corrals for a long time before he drove on. Let me tell you about the summer itself, because this story does not end with the vaccination window. The fly pressure in 2019 was, as predicted, the worst Custer County had seen since 2014. The pink eye incidents in operations that had fallen behind on vaccination ran to 4.5% of their cattle by the end of August. In a year when the market was already tighter than anyone wanted, losing 4.5% of your animals to a preventable condition is the kind of loss that changes the arithmetic of the year in ways that are hard to recover from. Harriet Cobb's herd finished the summer at 0.5% incidence. This was partly the vaccination timing, and partly the face fly control protocol she ran in conjunction with it, and partly the fact that the Cobb place was managed with the close daily attention of an operation where the person in charge was in the pasture every morning and knew the animals well enough to catch early signs before they became expensive problems. Her input cost for the vaccination program, including the vaccine, the crew hours, and the supplies, was $14.20 per head. The county average for operations using the managed platform, including the subscription cost, the crew hours, the duplicate vaccine doses from the confusion on July 8th, and the extended window labor came out closer to $19.80 per head. In a year when the margin was already thin, that $5.60 per head difference across a herd of any size was the difference between a year that was hard and a year that had a number at the end of it that you didn't want to show to your banker. Harriet had a hard year, everybody did. She had built her operation to survive hard years, not to perform in easy ones. Let me tell you about the conversation that happened in November of 2019, because it is the one that matters most. Drew Schofield drove out to the Cobb place on a Wednesday morning in the second week of November after the shipping was done and the corrals were empty and the county had had time to sit with what the summer had cost. He had called the day before and asked if he could come by. Harriet had said yes without asking why. He found her in the calving barn doing the pre-winter check on the equipment she stored there in the off-season, going through the headgate mechanism and the hydraulic table, tightening fittings, making notes in a small spiral notebook she kept in her chest pocket. She did not stop working when he walked in. She looked up, said good morning, and kept moving down the line of equipment. Drew stood near the door for a moment, then he said, "I owe you an apology for the comment about error rates at the meeting in Miles City." He said it without a preamble, the way a person says something they have been thinking about for long enough that the time for building up to it has passed. Harriet set down her wrench. She looked at him. "Sit down," she said. Drew sat on the running board of the hydraulic table trailer. Harriet leaned against the headgate and folded her arms. The barn smelled like hydraulic fluid and old hay, and the particular cold that comes into a building in November when the heating hasn't been turned on yet, because you're not sure you're going to need it quite yet. "You were right about the error rates," Harriet said. "I know that. A card file maintained by one person on 340 head is not the same thing as a verified digital system on 3,000 head. I understand the difference." She paused. "But your system needed three things to work that morning. It needed power, it needed a server that somebody else was running, and it needed somebody who knew what to do when neither of those things were available." She looked at him steadily. "My system needed two things. It needed me to know my cattle, and it needed me to keep the cards current." Drew was quiet for a moment, then he said, "The outage cost the county between $60,000 and $80,000 in lost working days and duplicate inputs. I've been sitting with that number since July." "I know," Harriet said. "Carl told me what people were saying." Drew looked at the card file box sitting on the workbench. He had noticed it when he walked in, the same metal box with the latch and the handle, the kind you could buy at any farm supply store for $11. "How do you keep it current?" he asked. 340 animals, 5 years of records. How do you actually maintain that without errors?" Harriet walked to the workbench and picked up the box. She set it on the hydraulic table in front of him and opened it. The cards were arranged in sequence by ear tag number, each one worn at the edges from handling, each one with the same format, tag number at the top. Dates down the left margin in blue pen, a notation for each event in her handwriting, a small red dot in the upper right corner when the animal was current. "You build the system once and you never let it get behind," she said. "Every time an animal comes through the chute, the card comes out of the box and a notation goes on it before the animal leaves the pen. Not that evening. Not the next morning. Before the animal leaves the pen," she looked at Drew, "the error doesn't happen at the card. The error happens when you let time pass between the event and the record." Drew looked at the cards for a moment. He picked one up. The ink was clear, the dates were consistent, the format was the same from the first entry to the last. "That's what the RFID system does." he said. "It records at the moment of the event. The reader is at the chute. The data goes in when the animal goes through." Dollars. "Yes," Harriet said, "it does. And when it's working, it's faster than I am, and it's more legible, and it catches things I might miss." She set the box back down. "But it doesn't do anything when it isn't working." Dollars. Drew drove back to Billings that afternoon with something that had not been there when he came. It was not guilt exactly, and it was not regret exactly. It was the specific understanding of a man who sells solutions for a living and who has had to reckon, for the first time in a serious way, with the difference between what a solution can do and what a solution can do when the conditions it depends on are unavailable. Dollars. He did not stop selling livestock management software. The software was good and the county needed it. But he started having a different conversation with his clients after that fall. Dollars. He started asking them whether they had a backup system. He started asking whether the backup system was current. He started mentioning Harriet Cobb's name, not as an argument against the software, dollars, but as an argument for understanding what you were doing before you handed the task to something else. Dollars. Let me tell you about the winter of 2020, because the story doesn't end in the calving barn. Dollars. The county extension livestock specialist that year was a woman named Margaret Osley, dollars, who had covered the Custer County territory for 9 years and who had watched the precision livestock technology adoption in the region with the careful attention of someone whose job required her to separate what worked from what looked like it worked. Dollars. Margaret had been compiling the summer health outcome data from across the county, and she had noticed something in the numbers. Dollars. The operations that had lost working time to the platform outage had, on average, vaccinated their cattle 5 days later than originally scheduled. In a high fly pressure year, 5 days of delay in a vaccination program translated to a measurable increase in early season exposure before immunity was established. The county's overall pinky eye incidence of 4.5% in affected herds reflected that exposure. Dollars. The operations that had vaccinated on schedule, including the Cobb place, were running at 0.5 to 1% incidence. Dollars. Margaret put that analysis in her winter producer newsletter. She did not name Harriet Cobb. She did not say anything about card files or $11 metal boxes. Dollars. She noted that the platform outage in July had created an unintended comparison between operations that maintained redundant record systems and operations that did not, dollars, and that the results were consistent with the research on the relationship between vaccination timing and disease incidence in high-pressure fly years, dollars. She suggested that producers consider what their backup procedure looked like if their primary record-keeping system was unavailable during a critical working window. Dollars. The newsletter went to 280 operations in the county. Harriet Cobb read it at the kitchen table on a morning in January and set it down beside her coffee and did not say anything about it to anyone. But 5 ranchers called the extension office that winter asking about manual record-keeping practices for livestock health. Margaret Osley referred 2 of them to Harriet Cobb. Dollars. Both of those 2 drove out to the Cobb place in February, when the corrals were empty and there was time to sit and talk without the pressure of cattle waiting on the other side of the fence. Harriet showed them the card system. She showed them the format she used, the notation conventions her father had developed, and she had refined, the way the box was organized, the rule she kept about never letting time pass between the event and the record. Dollars. One of those 2 ranchers was Pete Halverson, who had adopted Cattle Track Pro within a month of taking over his father's operation, and who had been in the room in Miles City on the morning of July 8th. Dollars. Pete was 33 years old and had never managed a livestock vaccination program without digital support. Dollars. He sat at Harriet's kitchen table for 2 hours that February morning and asked questions that told you he was thinking seriously about what he was hearing, not politely waiting to leave. Dollars. At the end of the visit, he asked if he could come back in the spring and watch Harriet run the first day of shoot work before he set up his own backup system. Harriet said yes. Let me tell you about the spring of 2020 because it is where this story turns forward. Pete Halverson came out to the Cobb place on the first morning of spring shoot work before the crew arrived and stood at the corner of the working alley and watched Harriet pull the day's cards from the box and rubber band them in order. He watched her walk through the pen before the cattle were moved, counting head, matching the visual to the card count. He watched Boyd set up the chute and Adrian position herself at the exit gate with the marker for the ear tags they would check against the cards as each animal came through. He watched Harriet work. After the third pen, he asked if he could run the cards for a pen while she watched. She handed him the rubber-banded stack and stepped back. He ran the pen. He was slower than Harriet. He missed one notation at first and had to call the animal back to confirm the tag number before he marked the card, but he ran it. When the pen was done, he stood there and looked at the stack of completed cards in his hand, each one updated, each one current, each one representing an animal on the place whose status he now knew because he had written it down himself. He said, "I understand why you do it this way." He went home and bought a card file box at the Farm Supply in Miles City. He set up his own system over the course of 3 evenings that week, working from his digital records to populate the initial cards. He kept his cattle track subscription. He was not Harriet Cobb and had no intention of becoming Harriet Cobb, but he had a backup now, and the backup was calibrated and current, and he understood how to use it. In July of 2020, the cattle track platform did not go down. The season ran smoothly. Pete used his digital system the entire time and did not touch the card file. But the card file was in the truck and the entries were current, and he knew exactly what he would do if the morning arrived when the tablet showed him an error screen instead of a working order. Let me tell you one last thing about Harriet Cobb because there is one more turn in this story. In the spring of 2023, Harriet's daughter, Lynn, came home from 4 years managing a large cattle operation in the Nebraska Sandhills to help run the Cobb place through a period when Harriet's hip was giving her trouble and the spring workload was going to be more than she could manage alone. Lynn was 29 years old and had spent those 4 years running health programs on a 6,000-head cow-calf operation with the full stack of precision livestock technology. Electronic ID, integrated health records, automated weigh systems, the kind of infrastructure that made the Cobb place look like a different century. She was good at it, she had been trained on it, had been shaped by it, understood livestock health management through the lens of systems that processed and stored and recalled information faster and more reliably than any person could do by hand. Lynn sat at the kitchen table with her mother in March of 2023 and talked about the spring program. She wanted to look at upgrading the record system. She wanted to at least consider cattle track or something comparable. She made the case clearly and without condescension, because she had been raised to make cases clearly and because she respected what her mother had built. Harriet listened to all of it. Then she said, "That all sounds right. Look into it. If it makes sense for the operation, do it." And then she said, "But run 1 season on the card system first. Learn the cattle on paper before you hand it to a platform. Because when the platform isn't there, the cattle still are." Lynn looked at her mother for a moment. She thought about the Nebraska operation, about the 6,000 head she had managed without ever writing an animal's vaccination history in pen on a card. She thought about whether what her mother was asking was practical knowledge or sentiment. Then she thought about what she had heard over the years from people in this county, from Carl Tremblay, from Pete Halverson, from Margaret Osley's newsletter that Harriet kept in a folder in the ranch office, about a July morning in 2019 when the system went dark and one operation just kept working, and she said, "Okay." Dollars. She ran the spring of 2023 on the card system. It was the hardest record-keeping she had ever done. Holding the card, reading the history, writing the notation before the animal left the pen, tracking 60 animals through a chute with a rubber-banded stack of paper in one hand and a pen in the other. It was a different kind of attention than the tablet work she was used to. Dollars. By the end of the first week, her handwriting had gotten smaller and neater because there was only so much room on the card, and the room had to be used carefully. Dollars. By the end of the first month, she understood something she had not understood before. She knew these animals, not as records in a database she could search by tag number. Dollars. She knew them the way you know something when you have written it down yourself and read it back and written it again, when the information has passed through your hands instead of through a reader and a server and a screen. Dollars. She knew which animals had a history of slow response and needed a second look at the booster interval. Dollars. She knew which pens ran hot in July and needed the fly control adjusted. She knew the operation the way her mother knew it, not because she had looked it up, but because she had paid attention to it. Dollars. She put cattle track on the system the following spring. She used it every day, and it worked well, and the records were clean, and the working orders were accurate, but the card file stayed in the truck. She had rebuilt it herself, in her own handwriting, with the same notation format her grandmother had used in the green ledger notebooks that still sat above the desk in the ranch office. Dollars. In July of 2024, a cellular tower upgrade in the county disrupted the connectivity for the RFID reader app for a morning. Lynn disengaged the tablet and ran the day's shoot work from the card file. Her crew did not break stride. The cattle were worked. The records were updated. She finished the pen before lunch. Dollars. Harriet Cobb is 62 years old now and does not run the chutes herself anymore. She walks the pastures in the evenings the way her father used to walk them. Dollars. Looking at the grass and the cattle and the things that take a long time to learn to see. Lynn runs the operation. The card file box is on the passenger seat of Lynn's truck during working season. Dollars, a newer box than the one Harriet used, bought at the same farm supply store in Miles City, the same $11. Dollars. Lynn's daughter is 7 years old and has already asked what the cards are for. And Lynn has started showing her, one card at a time, explaining the notation and the format and the rule about writing it down before the animal leaves the pen. Dollars. The platform told every rancher in Custer County to stop on the morning of July 8, 2019. One rancher who had never asked a server for her working orders kept going. Her cattle were worked, her records were current. Her herd finished the summer at 0.5% incidence in a county that averaged 4.5. Dollars. Some knowledge does not become obsolete. It waits. It sits in a metal box on the passenger seat of a truck, maintained by someone who understood, before it became inconvenient to understand, that the day you need a backup is never the day you have time to build one. Dollars. The cattle, as Harriet Cobb said on a July afternoon while a county full of ranchers sat on hold with a technical support line, don't know what software you're using. Dollars. I've thought about Harriet Cobb more times than I expected to for a woman I've never met. I think about her on the mornings when something I depend on stops working. The app, the connection, the system that was supposed to make things easier, and I feel that familiar frustration of being stopped by something outside my control. Dollars. On those mornings, I find myself thinking about a metal card file box on the passenger seat of a truck and a woman who understood something so clearly that she never had to scramble to understand it in a crisis. Dollars. What Harriet had was not luck. That is the part that matters most to me. When the platform went down on the morning of July 8th and a county full of ranchers sat on hold with a technical support line, Harriet was already 41 animals into her day because she had made a choice years earlier that was not convenient and was not fashionable and was not endorsed by any distributor in a clean company jacket. She had looked at a system that required things she couldn't control, and she had decided that her standard was different. That is a moral position, not a religious one, not a philosophical abstraction, a practical, daily lived decision about what kind of person she was going to be in relation to her work. She was going to be someone who knew what she was doing, not just someone who operated a system that knew for her. There is a kind of intelligence that I think gets undervalued because it doesn't look impressive from the outside. It isn't the intelligence of the demonstration at the fairgrounds, the kind that comes with a brochure and a projected error rate and a room full of people nodding along. It is the intelligence of the person in the back of the room asking what happens when this stops working. Harriet asked that question in 2017 and got an unsatisfying answer and drove home and put the brochure on the seat next to the card file and never went back. That was not stubbornness. That was clear thinking about risk, about dependency, about the difference between what a system can do and what a system can do when the conditions it assumes are unavailable. I want to think the way she thinks. I am not always sure I do. And then there is the part that I find hardest to talk about without it sounding simpler than it is. Harriet ran her card system through decades when everyone around her was moving away from it. She maintained it when it was redundant. She kept the entries current when no one was checking. She did the work of the notation before the animal left the pen, not that evening, not the next morning, every time, for 16 years. That kind of persistence, the kind that doesn't have an audience and doesn't get acknowledged and only becomes visible on the one morning when everything else fails, that is the kind I want to build in myself. Not the dramatic kind, not the kind that shows up for the hard moment and disappears afterward. The quiet, daily, unwitnessed kind that makes the hard moment possible to handle. Drew Schofield drove out to that calving barn in November and said he owed her an apology, and I think he meant it. And I think what he was really apologizing for was the version of himself that had laughed at something he didn't understand. I recognize that person. I have been that person. The one who mistakes the newness of something for its superiority, who confuses the confidence of a good sales pitch with the reliability of the thing being sold. The apology mattered. The conversation that followed mattered more. Harriet didn't tell him the software was wrong. She told him what it needed to work and what happened when those things weren't there, and then she showed him her card file and explained the one rule that made it reliable. Write it down before the animal leaves the pen. Don't let time pass between the event and the record. I think about that rule in contexts that have nothing to do with cattle. The event and the record, the action and the acknowledgement of it. The gap between those two things is where errors live. And Harriet had figured out how to close that gap with a pen and a card and the discipline to do it the same way every time. That is not a small thing. That is, in fact, everything.